I mean, have you ever seen something like that? Huh. All right, so today I said that there were a couple episodes that I very much want to go over before we get to part 2 and before we see Izzy's wonderful 2D presentation on chapters 11 to 18, 22, and 23. I really want to talk about the Sierra Morena. I want to talk about Cardenio, the wild man that we meet in the Sierra Morena. I want to talk a little bit about the love square that he finds himself in and found himself in, and the conditions that led to his insanity. And then I want to talk about Don Quixote being in a cart and being taken back home, the conditions under which he's taken back home. And I suppose I also want to talk about the final story in part 1, which is the story of Eugenio and Anselmo and Leandra. And I would also like to talk about the story of the reckless impertinent. Also, sometimes I think in our translation is called the man who was recklessly curious. I'm going to give pride of place to Cardenio's. So last time we spoke, we ended with the scene of Don Quixote meeting Gines de Pasamonte, as well as the galley slaves, freeing them, thinking that he was doing something just, and yet acting against the justice of the king. These are prisoners. These were prisoners of the crown. Now, the Holy Brotherhood will be coming after Don Quixote. It's possible that they were already coming after him before because of one of his hijinks, like fighting against the goat herds with the 2 armies, the dead body, various of the episodes that have come from before that led to physical harm for Don Quixote, and especially for Sancho when he was tossed in the blankets, which I think you noticed was mentioned again and again, and even in part 2 it gets mentioned again. So Don Quixote, following where Marcella, after the Gristosimo and Marcella episode goes into the Sierra Morena. And this is a forest-like area. This is a place of the pastoral. This is where this sort of cross-dressing woman, in order to eschew her social responsibility as an endowed a future lady who will be married to some man, can leave her gender behind as well as her social position. She can go and be free, as it were. And so here, Don Quixote decides that he can be free and he can truly do penance for Dulcinea. This is something that the chivalric heroes do occasionally. In fact, Ruggiero from Orlando Furioso, actually, I think it's actually Orlando. He loses his wits because of this allegorical woman, Angelica, who herself starts dating Amor rather than him. He loses his mind and literally has to go to the moon. You know, we have this expression now, right? What do you call someone who's crazy? There's an old sort of cartoon based on this. Yes? Over the moon is interesting because sometimes you over the moon means you're happy, yeah, but I guess so happy that you're crazy, yes? Loony, right? Loony, like Looney Tunes. That obviously comes from moon, with moon S, there we go, which is what? Monday, which is moon day. To be loony is like to be like the luna, as opposed to sol in Latin. Sol is sun, and luna is moon. And so to be a lunatic is to be somebody who's affected by the moon. And so he is literally a lunatic in that he goes to Luna, the place of the moon. And so the idea of being driven insane by the doings of one's lover is reiterated here, not subverted in the same way that it is in the Gristosimo and Marcella instance, where does a beloved owe it to the person who loves the beloved to love that person back, particularly if there's no existing relationship prior to that? That's, I think, a very living and interesting question. In any case, while Don Quixote is here in the Sierra Morena, he wants a couple things to happen. He's going to strip only the bottom half of his clothing, not the first half, and do some cartwheels in front of Sancho that Sancho will never forget. Because he is obviously old and wounded and is not reported to be the most attractive person in the world as it is, and is obviously not showing off the most attractive part of himself. Even his face, we know, is sorrowful, right? And so, while he is doing this penance, he wants his lady Dulcinea to know And so he constructs a dulcet, a sweet letter that he expects Sancho, himself illiterate, to take to Dulcinea into Boso while he does his penance. Just to fast forward a little, it will be the case, and I think we talked about this, that Sancho does not take the letter, ends up running into the priest and the barber at Juan Polemecos and and is, of course, while he's approaching the end, is thinking about being tossed in the blankets again, and how that was not enchantment, but must have been real, and even if it was enchantment, it was real enough for him to be harmed and for him to remember it. When Sancho is returning with the priest and the barber, they run into another shepherd with beautiful feet, supposedly. And these beautiful feet indicate to them that there must be something more to the shepherd. It turns out that the shepherd is himself, like Marcella, herself, and that this is Dorotea. They recruit this Dorotea to act, because she has apparently read many stories of chivalric romance, to play the role of Princess Miko Mikona. And Princess Miko Mikona will help the priest and the barber to convince Don Quixote that there is a giant named Ponda Philando who must be defeated by him, and his because he has taken over the kingdom of Miko Mikona. The idea is therefore to trick Don Quixote into coming from the Sierra Morena through the town in which he lives, La Mancha, and to keep him there in that city, though he is supposed to be on a mission to take out this giant at some point. Now, back to the sort of present. During the Sierra Morena, we run into a character, a wild man who sometimes seems to have his wits and is capable of telling Don Quixote and Sancho about what led to him being in this place. And we also hear about him from some goatherds who say that there's a wild man who sometimes attacks them and steals their food, though they've talked to him before, and sometimes he seems to have his wits, and they told him just to ask for food and they'll give it to him. And so who is this man? What happens to him? And one thing I want to say about this man and the nature of the story that he tells before I say more information about him is that he has an interesting conceit to the story that he tells Don Quixote just prior to Sancho leaving with the letter for Dulcinea, which he doesn't actually have on his person, which is this: if you interrupt me, I will not be able to continue on with my story. Very similar to when Sancho said, if you interrupt me, I will not be able to continue on with my story. And if you don't keep an accurate account of the amount of cattle that have crossed the river. Obviously, Don Quixote does not keep count. Sancho is interrupted, and then he stops his story and does not continue on. It's sort of interesting. It reminds me of sort of a fairy tale being told by a parent where they say, I'll not tell you the rest. Often parents don't follow through with that, but both Cardenio and Sancho do follow through. Sancho does not continue with his tale, and Cardenio, and this is sort of, I guess, this is very, very interesting. Let me see if I have it written right here. Yes, yes, is it here? I'm just going to tell it to you. There is a debate. So Don Quixote interrupts Cardenio because Cardenio has what he thinks is an incorrect opinion about the fictional character of Queen Madasima. And the idea that Cardenio has is that Queen Madasima had married a surgeon. And surgeons at this time, unlike in this time in the West, were considered a lowly bunch, almost outcasts, not the high station that they have these days. And so Don Quixote cannot let that stand. He's like, with a surgeon, Queen Madasima? Absolutely not. And he tries to argue with this man who had told him not to, because of the state of his wits, it turns out, not to interrupt him because he would not be able to continue. Cardenio then goes wild, crazy, attacks Don Quixote, throws a stone at him, attacks Sancho, and Sancho ends up leaving. And we are left for the moment with thinking, who is this Cardenio? What happens to him? So I'm just going to sort of summarize that and tell you a little bit of history of what I think is interesting about that. Let me see if I can find it right here. Yes, here we go. Cardenio's story. Cardenio was in love with a woman named Luscinda. But as a young man, his father wanted to send him off to a local duke in order to establish a career that would lead to a better life for him. He loves Luscinda so much that he goes to Luscinda's father and asks for her hand in marriage. Supposedly they're of similar rank. Everything about them makes it so this should be a match made in heaven. Notice, however, that Cardenio is not Don Cardenio. That will be an element of importance later. Sort of funny. When funny things happen to the lecturer that are extra to the lecture. When Cardenio asks Luscinda's father for her hand in marriage, he says, "I'd love to give you her hand. You two are great. However, it is the convention that your father must come to me and ask. And so that needs to happen." Well, Cardenio lets it lie for the moment, goes off to the local duke, or the duke that's near, and starts to work for him. Where once he enters the duke's court, he also meets the two duke's sons. One is older, one is younger. The older one has a little bit of affection for him, doesn't seem to like him that much. The younger one really takes an interest. And part of what's underlying his taking an interest in him is something that we find out from the story of Dorotea. So backtrack a little bit. We found out that Dorotea is a woman who fell in love with a local man named Don Fernando, indicating that he has a higher position than her, that he's part of the gentility Don Quixote is claiming that he is a member of. Well, apparently this Don Fernando fell for this young, not peasant girl, but not nobility girl, somebody in sort of the middle class of this time. And he conspires with her maid to have a tete-a-tete with her. And so there's some complicity with the maid. And there in the room with this woman for whom he has such lust and feels such lascivious feelings, he promises her, very like Dido and Aeneas before of the Aeneid, that I will marry you. Just let me lay with you first. And so she said, and he doesn't quite put the point on the I in that way, but she says, well, since we are going to be married, I am already yours. Therefore, no problem if we lay together tonight and even the next night, because I am basically your wife. I think the line in translation, it's actually quite a good line, is that my maid left and I ceased to be. I ceased to be. The idea that maiden is a virginal woman in this case. Then after the second day, he does come to see her on a second day. He never comes back. Well, why is that? Shift back to the Cardenio story. Cardenio meets the second son of a duke. What is his name? Don Fernando. Tells him some stories about this beautiful Luscinda, shows him the letters too. Remember the connection between literature and this story too. This is a story about stories. It's a story about vocal stories, oral stories, about literature and the relationship to reality. There are writers in here. In fact, hopefully I get to the second novel that we see in this text. We've heard of Gines de Pasamonte's autobiography, which is not yet complete, but we will also talk about the novel of The Curious and Pardon. And so literature, there's literature in this literature, and obviously the 300 books of Don Quixote, with a few notable exceptions, including Cervantes' La Galatea, are all destroyed. Cardenio tells the second son of the Duke, Don Fernando, everything about Luscinda. And as he talks about Luscinda, Don Fernando develops some ideas. But in particular, he claims he is so interested in what Cardenio has said, they better go really fast. Let's go really fast away from where we are now, back to your town. Why does he want to go so quickly back to Cardenio's town? Is it anything to do with Cardenio? Anything to do with Luscinda in the first place? No, it has to do with he just laid with this woman who's expecting him to marry her. He's trying to skip town. And he does. But this Fernando, Once he gets to the town of Luscinda and sees Luscinda, and he's even reading, having read to him the letters that Luscinda writes, Cardenio, he starts to fall for Luscinda. Without telling his friend Cardenio, who doesn't know all of this about him in the way that we do, a lot of dramatic irony, we would say here. Don Fernando sets up, puts together a little situation that doesn't quite put him on par with Iago from Othello, but it is a nefarious situation. He conspires to have Cardenio go buy several horses from his brother. So Cardenio will have to leave the city for a few days in order to pay for these horses and bring them back. And there's even an additional wrinkle added that the money is not yet present, that Don Fernando can send Cardenio, but the money for the horses will have to come later. It turns out that the money is all present at every moment. The reason that Cardenio needs to be outside of the city, however, is that Don Fernando is going to go talk to the father of Luscinda and set up a marriage with him. Why will the father do this? Now, this is where it gets a little bit cutthroat. Why would the father, who knows Cardenio, who knows how Cardenio feels, because Cardenio has himself asked for his daughter's hand in marriage, why would the father do this or even consider this? Has to deal with only one detail that I mentioned earlier. He's Don Fernando, right? He's Don. He's the son of the Duke. What father would not want that for his daughter? And I keeping in the back of my mind the debate that Sancho and Teresa / Juana Panza have in chapter 5 of part 2. Don Fernando continues to be successful. He does set up this way. Cardenio only gets back to the city when the wedding is happening. It's very like Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate, if you've ever seen that movie. It's a very climactic movie near the end. What he sees, and again, dramatic irony is very important here. And what I say by dramatic irony is that we know what's going on because we know what's underlying the situation on both sides. Each individual in this situation only knows one side. Cardenio only knows his part of the story. Dorotea only knows her part of the story. Don Fernando only knows his part of the story. We're a little bit more omniscient, though there are so many details to keep in our heads that probably we didn't keep them all present. What does Cardenio see? Cardenio sees Luscinda say, "I do," and then faint. And then, it's like a schism in his mind. He goes crazy, and then he runs off to the Sierra Morena and strips off his clothes and tells us the story. It's awful. He's driven crazy. He's literally driven crazy by what happens. What does Don Fernando see? He sees a successful conclusion to his venture. Even though there is this one woman, Dorotea, back in his home city, to whom he was married, at least in their hearts, he's still very happy to be marrying this Luscinda in a more official sort of way. Okay. Luscinda, however, it turns out, had two things on her person besides her wedding ring. Isn't that a conflict she had? Yes. A dagger and a letter. The letter says, "I am actually the wife of Cardenio. Never be your wife." Don Fernando finds this. Dagger is for what? Suicide, not homicide, not to kill Don Fernando. So you might consider it. Cardenio certainly would. Let's kill herself. But what actually happens when the moment to act arises? She faints. So nobody really knows the entirety of the situation until it comes out later. Where? Juan Palomeque's inn. Because when Don Quixote is there, alongside with Sancho, the priest, the barber, and Princess Micomicona, who is Dorotea, who should come through the door at some point? Don Fernando and Luscinda. And so I can't get too much more into this because of limitations of time at this moment, but perhaps I'll get a little bit more into the details of this. But what ends up happening, and this is ridiculous and very ridiculous in the same way that a sort of Shakespearean pastoral romance would be ridiculous, is that everything seems to work out. What do I mean by this? Luscinda does not commit suicide or kill Don Fernando. Cardenio. Well, so, okay, let me say it like this. Dorotea, when she is telling her story, does not know that Cardenio is there. Cardenio then identifies her and her father, and then they come to know who each other are. And their plan is this. Cardenio obviously doesn't want to marry Dorotea, but Dorotea wants to marry Don Fernando because they were supposed to be married. Basically, what ends up happening, and this seems sort of unbelievable, and perhaps it is unbelievable, is that Dorotea is returned to Don Fernando. All is hunky-dory. And Cardenio and Luscinda are returned to each other. Love square, I told you. No one's left out in the same way as a triangle. So, two things about that, because I think it probably upsets you a little bit that Don Fernando gets away with all of this. And this is one of the perennial critical questions, and many critics write about this. And people in my profession, we either call ourselves critics or theorists. Where is the justice for what Don Fernando did? And so I only have one sort of, let's call it pale response to that, which is this. In the end, this inn full of enchanters, as Don Quixote claims, Don Quixote has a dream. And in this dream, he is fighting against a giant. And this giant he identifies as Fernando, the very giant that he was supposed to defeat for Princess Metempsychosis. Turns out that it's a giant wineskin. It's where all the wine is for the innkeeper. And he cuts off its head and defeats it. This obviously drives the innkeeper crazy. And he's like, you better pay for all of this. It's a very expensive amount of goods. But Don Quixote thinks in defeating this giant in his dream, which in reality is a wineskin, he has defeated the mythological antagonist that Princess Makona brokered a deal with him to defeat. So he is removed from his obligation. I'm not firm on this interpretation, but I just want to suggest it to you. Insofar as Princess Makona is Dorotea, is that correct? Did Dorotea play Princess Makona? Yes. Who is the antagonist for Princess Makona that Don Quixote must defeat? And the Fernando, a giant. In Dorotea's actual life, who is the antagonist? Don Fernando. What is the problem with Don Fernando? The fact that he is too lascivious and lustful, right? He has a commitment to one woman, but then he lays with her and is sort of over it. Then he moves on to another and then marries her. He's like not a Don Fernando, but far more like a Don Juan, right? And so some critics suggest that when Don Quixote defeats this giant, that this giant himself represents lust, and that lust is defeated in this inn, and that is why things are allowed to be set right. That it is not Don Fernando himself as a character that is the antagonist, but is itself the sin of lust that is within him that causes all of this to occur in the first place. And I think that that's a very interesting symbolic way of seeing this. And I think that's also a very interesting way of seeing what happens with the wineskins. In fact, this is sort of Freudian or Jungian, right? There's a psychological element to this. The mythological story that Princess Makona, the priest and the barber, and they're in disguise too. You remember the beard falling off of the priest, and Don Quixote saying, "Wow, there's no blood or anything. That's amazing that can happen." And how'd you just put it back on? That the actual story itself, or the mythological story that is overlaid on top of the story, is itself representative of what's really happening. And I think that's very interesting that even in the imagination of the characters who are trying to fool a certain character in order to bring about a certain event, that their imaginations still follow the same narrative line as what is happening in the mise-en-scène, in the narrative itself. As if there is a restriction on your imagination to in some way mirror your own reality, is what I think I see. I see several critics suggesting that, but possibly see that here myself. Okay. Man who is recklessly curious. I'm just going to save that. I'm going to save that because I think I want to conclude the first part, which I should have concluded last time with mentioning the Man Who is Recklessly Curious novel, or The Reckless Impertinent. It depends on how it's translated from the Spanish. They're both correct. And also the very last, chapters 51 and 52 story that we hear about shepherds and shepherdesses, Eugenio and Salmo and Leandra, and then move on to part 2. But for now, I think I need to give a little bit more time to the person who is going to present. And then remember that great maxim that I said at the beginning of the class today.